Oh, like
Put it here.
here?
Yeah, like right under. Yeah.
Great. Cool.
Yeah.
Testing.
But
Thank you.
another thing, camera on you,
Mhm.
so don't go too much past there, and like. just
Yeah,
in
well, I
areas
need to
where-
kind of hit the
Oh,
next.
yeah.
So it's like right here, okay?
Oh, that's perfect.
Okay.
Just to let you know, because some people often there's like 40 people or 50 people usually
Yeah.
on Zoom or YouTube.
Yeah. That's cool.
I'll give you an intro. And
Okay.
sorry.
Everyone, welcome to another NICO seminar. Viv Epstein is joining us from Stanford. He is a postdoctoral researcher at Stanford.
Very much. So Ziv's a postdoctoral researcher at Stanford. He graduated from the MIT Media Lab. We started out in the Media Lab at the same lab in 2017. So Ziv has published in Science and Nature and Science Advances and Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And he's published at quite a few computer science conferences. He's well published, but he's also an artist. And so he's been an artist at Burning Man. He's been an artist at artist in residence at Ars Electronica. And I want to mention that he's giving a talk today, right now, which you all are here for. But if you want to hear more and hear about, so this is what Megan has organized. What is generative AI for? And so it's a discussion and an AI experiment plus snacks with computer scientist and multimedia artist Ziv Epstein. I also want to mention that next week is Chris Bale is coming. So just keeping you guys all posted for what's happening at NICO. And without further ado, Ziv, take it away.
Thanks so much. All right. Thanks so much. It's an honor to be here. Very excited. So today I'm going to be talking about reinventing the attention machine. And essentially, I think we're all very excited about the kind of possibilities of AI and generative AI, but also there's a lot of kind of perils and kind of dangers there. And a lot of those dangers stem from the lack of these systems being aware of the human experience. And a lot of my work is trying to understand how we can, integrate the human experience with AI systems through this lens of attention. So to frame this, I want to start in perhaps a different place. So this is the House of the Commons. This is the Parliamentary Hall of the UK. And this building was actually destroyed during World War II. And as a result, the government had to rebuild it. And trying to decide what to do, they actually decided to build the exact same building over again, not something new, not something different. And when asked about this, Winston Churchill famously said, "We shape our buildings, and thereafter they shape us." So this idea that there's this kind of interaction and this feedback loop between the built environment and the political and social structures that undergird and enact those. And the reason I bring this up is because today we are also in the grand stage of building, but the edifices that we are building are not parliamentary halls, they are AI systems. And just as we shape our buildings and they shape us, we shape AI and AI shapes us. So that's kind of the claim I'm going to make. And I'm also going to argue that attention is the key bridge to understanding this feedback loop. But I'm not talking about the way that computer scientists usually think about attention. This is human attention. And attention, it turns out, human attention is all you need. And I'm going to argue that AI systems are training on a distorted notion of ground truth, and that this distortion is due to human attention. And as a result, these attention machines are hill climbing on attentional noise. So what do I mean by attention machines? So the idea is that there are AI systems out there. This could be a ranking system on social media, large language model. And the idea is that these are algorithmic amplifiers. They're taking certain voices and perspectives and uplifting and amplifying those and downweighting other ones. And critically, how are they trained? Which voices are they amplifying? There's a wide range of different behavioral inputs to these models that are used as cues to determine these amplifiers. And these range from being very automatic, such as dwelling and sharing, kind of more, interactions online, to much more kind of deliberative processes, such as accuracy judgments and defining values. However, across this board of different types of behavioral inputs, attention and human attention is this key mediating factor that's determining how these different behavioral inputs are inputted into algorithmic amplifiers. Then, as these AI systems go out and amplify, they then feed back through society into the behaviors that are being fed in the first place. And that kind of closes the loop of this feedback loop of how we shape AI and AI shapes us. So to give you three kind of quick, concrete examples of how attention is shaping what AI learns. First, we've seen that there's a disconnect between behavior and values. So this here is a plot taken from a blog post at Meta, where essentially they found that as you approach the prohibited content, there's allowed content, and as you get towards this policy line of prohibited content, engagement with content increases. And Mark Zuckerberg, the person who is capturing a lot of attention, himself even said, no matter where we draw the line for what is allowed, as a piece of content gets closer to that line, people engage with it more on average, even when they tell us afterwards that they don't like that content. So here we're observing this disconnect between behavior, which is engagement, and values, which is if you like the content in the first place. Second, we're seeing that this algorithmic amplification is actually creating legitimate harms to society. And so this is happening with homogenization. We're seeing the homogenization of culture, where outputs of AI-generated content maybe even get fed back into the inputs of new AI systems, which creates this flywheel of flattening. And also just we're getting kind of attenuated and used to seeing AI-generated outputs in various posters and graphic designs and logos and whatnot. This is also happening in science as well, where recently there was this scandal where people found hundreds of papers that were partially generated with ChatGPT. And you can imagine like what happens in this future where AI starts to do our science, and those are the papers that get cited, and it leads to this kind of potentially divergent homogenization. So overall, I think there's these concerns of a crisis of creativity, AI monoculture, and worries of the collapse of creative industries. And then a last kind of point here is that systems design is made complicated by meaningful disagreements about values. And this is this idea of pluralism and value pluralism. So here, for example, there's a question of, is it okay for government to moderate social media content available to the public? And if you really value security, you might say it is okay for the government to moderate content for terrorism and threats. But on the other hand, if you value freedom, it might not be okay to moderate any content as it endangers liberty. And in a sense, both of those are kind of valid responses, and it depends on what your values are. And we're seeing that AI systems have their own values reflected in them. So for example, LLMs, it turns out, poorly reflect the opinions of individuals who are elderly, widowed, or Mormons, and actually can exhibit left-leaning tendencies when fine-tuned. And we're also seeing this with image generators as well, where on one hand, the lack of trying to embed values leads to problems such as only generating white men for lawyers, or women for wait staff, or on the other hand, good intentions go awry when generating Black Nazis and Native American Vikings. So what should we do in these contexts, and how are values kind of embodied and reflected? So in this talk, I'm going to, again, argue that our attention shapes AI, and AI shapes our attention. And the kind of two key questions here is, one, to what extent is training data transformed by human attention, and how do we measure that? And the second is, how do we actually shift attention to make training data more deliberative and aligned with human values? So the outline for this talk is, first, I'm going to talk about how attention shapes what algorithmic amplifiers learn with a quick speculative vignette. Then I'll talk about the misalignment of behavior and values, and how that's actually driving misinformation sharing on social media, as well as an intervention to help fix that, and how it's even worse for dwell times, this kind of key measure of attention. And then we'll talk about my ongoing work at Stanford, where I'm a postdoc, trying to explicitly embed values into algorithmic amplifiers. And then finally conclude with this vision of attention ecologies. So to start, this idea of these feedback loops, there's this question of what content evolves when we focus on our values, and what happens when our attention is shifted to social elements. So what is the role of attention in kind of changing the dynamics of these in the limit, if we just kind of play this out in the long run? And this is, here I'm going to argue that attention distorts what AI gets trained on, and this is brittle, and that there's actually a lot of divergences in how attention filters into these different algorithmic amplifiers. And this is actually kind of expanding on building on, this is a science paper from 2006 that essentially explores how divergences in what people are shown and popularity can actually impact, outcomes such as popularity and inequality. So to do this, I'm going to introduce a speculative model organism to investigate the dynamics of algorithmic amplification. And so this is using something called GANs, which are generative adversarial networks, or at this point, generally antiquated networks. And the idea is you can actually use these GANs. They have image labels, and these are animals, and you can actually take these animals and blend them to create Ganimals. And this is joint work with Matt, where essentially you can blend a goldfish and a golden retriever together and get a golden fufa, which is one of these Ganimals. And we found these delightful and use this as a kind of model organism to explore evolution and how attention shapes what kinds of Ganimals evolve. In particular, we have 16 independent worlds that are all evolving independently of the other ones. And in particular, half of them are preference learning worlds. So in these worlds, attention is focused on personal preferences. You think carefully about what you like, what Ganimals you think are cute, and you're using that attention to determine how to vote and how to interact. On the other half, there are 8 social media worlds. So these are kind of like the scrolling experiences we see, and their attention is focused on social signals, such as how many other people have liked the Ganimals and which ones have other people interacted with and enjoyed. And here I'm going to kind of talk about an experiment we ran with over 500 people in a platform with over 10,000 users. I'll kind of gloss over the experimental design and methods of our CSEW paper, but happy to talk about it after in the Q&A. And in general, this is the key result, is that deliberation causes convergence and distraction due to social media causes divergence. And let me break that down. So this here is a map of all the possible Ganimals you could generate. And in particular, the orientation is based on the morphology of these Ganimals. What do they look like? What's the kind of nature of them? And what I'm going to show you is one data point for each world, where this is the average morphology of the kind of Ganimal that evolved in that world. So first, to show you the deliberative worlds, where people cared really about their preferences, what they cared about, what we see is convergence. In general, people liked, and there was convergence around Ganimals that had eyes, had a mouth, that had a nose. These are kind of dog-like Ganimals, right? They kind of fit what you might think people might like that goldfish, golden retriever hybrid we saw before. However, when we look at the social media worlds, where social cues were involved in how people made decisions, what we see is completely different. We see divergence. We see that the kinds of Ganimals that evolved are all over the place. And in a sense, people are distracted by these social cues. And as a result, you don't see convergence towards true preferences. You see initial random noise feeding away and getting divergence from these true preferences. So what we found here is that feedback loops cause unintended outcomes, and that algorithmic amplifiers are hill climbing on attentional noise. In particular, we found this because there was a value misalignment due to shifts in attention. In particular, without social cues, when people were caring focused about what Ganimals they wanted, content evolved to fit these prior conceptions. And you got dog-like Ganimals like this golden fupa here. Yes? Sure, yeah.
Yeah, really. I was wondering how much I can't recall the last paper if it was new songs or with, but I'm wondering how our priors, say like in the context of political beliefs, would it look less noisy? Oh. Sorry about that. Yeah, would that basically, if you had strong priors, say about political belief, do you think the social influence component would create less noise? Would it create actually more conformity? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. And indeed, in the original science paper, they took extreme measures. They went to great lengths to actually only show songs that they didn't think people had listened to already, because prior belief can really inform how these things work. And actually, that's one of the reasons I think the Ganimals is so interesting, because here, these AI-generated animals are completely foreign and novel. So it creates this kind of cultural laboratory to explore something where there are no preconceived notions. However, how this intersects with people's priors and what their beliefs are, I think is like super interesting. And as far as where it would intersect for divergence versus convergence, I would presume that people would just kind of latch on to things they already know and would kind of agglomerate on top of that. But I don't think we have any evidence that. It'd be a super cool thing to explore and follow up on. Sure.
So this is the old organic, right?
I would say it's a nuancing of what they found already. Their conclusion was that social cues introduce inequality and unpredictability. Exactly. So this is looking at within a world, there's convergence, but across worlds, there's divergence with the social cues. So I think this is a key thing is with the Salganik et al. Paper, they didn't know anything about the songs. They just could look at the aggregate effects of the dynamics of popularity. You know, here's songs, how many people like them. But here, since we know the morphology of all these animals, we can actually say, okay, we observe and we replicate the results of inequality and unpredictability for social cues. But then, okay, what kinds of animals are actually evolving in these social worlds where there is unpredictability and inequality? And it turns out the kinds of animals you get are divergent and diverse, actually. But critically, people, you know, they like dogs. And so without social cues, you go for the dogs. And so you click on those and you like those. But when there's social cues where you get inequality and these kind of things, you're actually attenuating to what other people's social signals are. So say, for example, with this one, this thing's kind of weird and blobby. So you might not actually like it that much, but there's no social cues. But once there's a social cue, you're like, oh, other people like this kind of odd blobby thing. Maybe I'll go along with it. And then you get these kind of diverse local trends. Any questions? Cool. Okay. So this is, though, in this kind of very interesting case study of AI-generated animals, but what are other effects of misdirected attention? And so here I'm going to talk about how misdirected attention is actually spreading misinformation on social media. And misinformation has received a lot of attention since 2016, but now there's the kind of worry that AI has supercharged it, where here there are images on Midjourney, for example, that have been viewed millions of times. And here I'm going to argue that misinformation spreads online because of a disconnect, again, between behavior and values. And here behavior is sharing on social media, and values are accuracy. And if this is true, then it also provides a way to prompt accuracy as a way to actually align sharing intentions and truth discernment. So let me unpack that. But first, I should say that traditional attempts to mitigate misinformation, AI-generated misinformation, don't actually seem to work in practice. So there's the idea of classifying as something true or false or authentic or synthetic. And this is hard because essentially, what is AI generated or what is true and false is fundamentally changing. So to do this classification, it fails generalizability and it's a non-stationary problem. Fact-checking is interesting, but unfortunately, fact-checking doesn't scale to the volume of content, especially when AI is able to generate so much content, and also introduces harms to fact-checker, such as exposure to crazy content and poor labor practices. And also watermarking is interesting, where you can annotate if something is true or false, or authentic or synthetic. But this has technical challenges and also requires massive cross-platform coordinations between different actors, which can be hard. So all I'm going to talk about here are these accuracy prompts, which is a psychologically grounded intervention that actually works. And unlike the classification, it generalizes to new examples. Unlike fact-checking, it's kind of infinitely scalable and flexible. And unlike watermarking, is a light touch, content neutral design intervention you can kind of slap on. And also working in the lab, we've shown impacts in the world as well, such as collaborations with Google to reduce misinformation on their platforms, as well as collaborations with TikTok. And recently, Meta ran a 33 million person RCT with these accuracy prompts. Okay, so this starts with this fundamental question of why do people share misinformation in the first place? And, a classic idea is that maybe simply people can't tell what is true from what is false. And so to test this, we took a series of headlines like the ones you see here. These are balanced on veracity, so half true, half false, and partisanship, so half pro-Democrat, half pro-Republican. And we asked people, to the best of your knowledge, is the claim in the above headline accurate? Yes or no? Then we take a second half of people, show them the same headlines, but then ask them, would you consider sharing this story online if you saw on social media? So to show you some results here, this is what % of the headlines were rated accurate. And I'm breaking them up for politically concordant news, so it aligns with your ideology, versus discordant news, so it's misaligned with your ideology. And I'll show you separate bars for true and false. And what we see here is that across the board, people rate true headlines as true and false headlines as false, and there's not really a difference in whether or not the news is politically concordant or discordant. However, when we look at sharing intentions, the results are completely different. What we see is that while indeed people say they would share true news more than false news, it's somewhat of a small difference. And what's more, people say they would share concordant news that aligns with their ideology more, significantly more, than news that misaligns with their ideology. So there's this kind of fundamental gap between sharing intentions and accuracy evaluations, which raises the question, what explains that gap and what can we do about it? So here I'm going to argue that this gap exists because of distraction by design. So I don't know about you, but a lot of time I'm browsing social media. It can look a little bit like this. All this content, all this FOMO, it's very overwhelming. It's very exhausting. And that's actually by design. If you actually think about where platforms are taking inspiration, there is actually kind of this idea of a slot machine and bright flashing lights, and you're kind of infinitely scrolling. That's not an accident. That's actually quite intentional due to the kind of platform incentives of these interfaces. So to kind of show that, I'm going to talk about how sharing interferes with truth discernment. So in this study published in Science Advances, we essentially take headlines like the ones similar, but here it's text instead of an image, and we ask people, how accurate is this headline? And there we see exactly what we saw before, where people say that true headlines are true and false headlines are false. Then, in a separate condition, we again ask people how accurate are those headlines. But first, we show them the same exact headline and ask them, would you share that headline if you saw on social media? And what we see there is that there's actually a dramatic decrease in about a 10% decrease in accuracy judgments when you first ask people about sharing. And the explanation for this is that basically online, people are juggling different contexts. So when you're just asked about accuracy, that first condition, you're thinking about it and you're kind of making your judgments and accuracy is maintained. However, in that second condition, when I ask you about sharing, then you have a lot of balls in the air and it's kind of hard to juggle it all. And as a result, accuracy drops. So this kind of suggests that accuracy is a mindset and it can be prompted. And so what I mean by that is that we can actually increase sharing discernment by prompting accuracy. So to show you what I mean, we have another condition where I show you the same headlines and ask you, would you share this headline? Yes or no? And there, again, we see very similar to what we saw before, where people say they would share true news more than false news, but it's kind of a small difference. But then in this other condition, I again ask you, would you share this headline? But first, I ask you, do you think this headline is accurate? Yes or no? And interestingly, when you first ask people about accuracy, prompting that mindset, what happens is it actually decreases the sharing of false news by half. So this kind of suggests that accuracy prompts might be a way to stem the sharing of misinformation on social media. And we've done a lot of work kind of exploring how this might work. Yes. Yeah, sure. That's right. Great point. Yes, exactly. So if you measure sharing discernment as the difference between true and false, this is significantly increasing sharing discernment. But looking at the overall rates of engagement, it is indeed true that this is decreasing the amounts of engagement, which is kind of hard to sell to platforms. And that's a great point. And I'll circle back to that. Thanks for sharing. Yeah.
Oh, question. Whoa, sorry. Okay, this is one priming. There's many possible primings. So if one were to consider the popularity, like if I were to predict, if I did a theory of mind task and we're trying to, how many eyeballs are going to be attracted to this versus that, is that going to expand, the variance of the difference, or is it going to maximize the surprise, that's likely going to increase basically false news over its proportion of influencing true news? Because news is news. News is news. Good news is surprising. So what this is one. These are prompt strategies, but obviously there's an environment of other like primings that take place, not just chaos. So like, what are those other primings, or how do you think about that?
Yeah. This is a great question, and I think just like some off the cuff responses to that is, I think that that's I think the problem of kind of this monolithic feed interface is that there's all these different social contexts that are all collapsing, and so how do we think about all the different cognitive resources that are availed when we think about these different environments? So I think the key idea here is that people are pretty good at discerning truth from falsehood, but they're not thinking about accuracy because of the setup of the platforms. But when you do ask people to think about accuracy, that kicks in. We do actually have more recent results that I don't think I'll talk about it here, but essentially the role of social cues. So if you ask people about popularity and kind of prompt the social dynamics, it seems that maybe that increases sharing discernment as well, but I don't think the literature is kind of solved on that. But I think these are the kind of questions we need to be asking: what are the different cognitive mindsets and styles that are invoked on social media? Which ones do users actually want? Which ones versus like that the platforms are kind of drilling into our minds based on their incentives? And how do we kind of open up this door for more transparency? So not a real answer, but I think these are like the right questions. And I think as we redesign social media, we need to keep these in mind very carefully. And this is just kind of a proof of concept of this idea. Yes?
So can you help me clarify this? In some sense, this reminds me of the Dave Run Nature paper about prompting accuracy.
That's the next slide. So I'll get there. Yeah.
This is prompt.
Yes.
Then what's the focus of this?
So this paper, and the title of it is "The Social Media Context Interferes with Truth Discernment." So it's actually this last figure, this one, where it's actually that when you prompt sharing, it undercuts accuracy judgments. So the idea is you can do either one. When you prompt sharing, it undercuts accuracy judgments, or when you prompt accuracy, it boosts sharing judgments. So this paper is kind of introducing the cognitive story behind how these distinct mindsets are interacting. But then once you have the way to prompt accuracy to increase sharing discernment, then it opens the door for these applied interventions, the Nature paper, which I'll talk about. That's a great point. And certainly there are strategies that misinformation producers use when they create this content. And I should say that in that experiment, at least, the base rate is 50-50. Half is true, half is false. How this changes when there's different base rates is important, especially given that we know that misinformation is sparse on social media. And I think it goes back to James' point as well, thinking about the fact that misinformation oftentimes is emotionally high valence. So how do we think about the diagnostic strategies for evaluating misinformation, given the kind of strategies that these content producers are using when generating content? Okay, maybe that's a nice bridge then to accuracy prompts. And, we've done a lot of work on this, showing that it works across prompting styles and demographic subgroups on large representative samples, also across cultures. So, in this paper, it's showing how it works in 16 countries and 6 continents and 9 languages with over 33,000 participants. And it's also super nice when AI becomes sufficiently realistic, because if you can't tell if something's true, AI generated or not, all you really have is your own critical thinking skills. So the idea here is it's really helping people tap into their own capabilities. Also, it doesn't rely on centralized arbiters of truth, and as a result promotes user autonomy by letting people think critically about what they think is real. But all the results I've shown you so far are hypothetical. This is, here's a screenshot of a social media post on social media. Would you share this if you saw it? Which is kind of a contrived setup in a sense. So to explore how this works in the real world, we turn to the field, which is this Nature paper, where essentially the idea is to see how this works in an ecologically valid setup by direct message Twitter users a one-item accuracy survey to see if that increases the quality of the news sources that they subsequently share. Let me break that down a little bit. First, we find and follow users who retweeted links to misinformation sites. Here, that's Breitbart and InfoWars. Then some of those users follow back the accounts, and we send them a direct message as a treatment. Then we collect all the tweets these people share before and after the direct message, and essentially compare the treatment, which are these post-direct message tweets, with control, which are these pre-DM tweets from those who've not yet been DM'd. This is called a stepped wedge design, kind of an advanced causal inference technique for field experiments, where you essentially want to treat all of the participants and therefore boost power. The overall followed over 130,000 accounts. 11,000 of those accounts followed us back. And after filtering out kind of various bot-like personas, get a final subject pool of over 5,300 participants. Intervention looks very similar to the interventions we saw before. It's just, how accurate is this headline? And the idea is we don't even really care what people respond. It's just the idea of thinking about accuracy for a moment in browsing and then seeing how that spills over into the rest of sharing decisions. And so now for some results, what I'm going to show you, this is at the domain level. So for websites, on the x-axis here, I have the average fact checker trustworthiness rating. So this is for each website, what was the average score of trustworthiness from third-party fact checkers? And on the y-axis, I have the change in relative tweet frequency. So anything above the 0 line means the direct message increased tweeting to. Anything below the 0 line, it actually decreased tweeting to. So what we see is overall a positive trend where the intervention is increasing tweeting to domains like the New York Times, CNN, and Washington Post, and decreasing tweeting to domains like Daily Caller, Breitbart, and Daily Wire. You will, however, observe that the intervention is actually increasing tweeting to Fox News, which is perhaps one of the more high-quality domains on the right. So to kind of conclude this section, what we saw with misinformation on social media is a misalignment due to shifts in attention. We saw that for sharing, there was a misalignment between behavior of sharing and values accuracy. And correspondingly, that accuracy prompts could be used to align sharing with values. And we were seeing the feedback loops caused by unintended outcomes. Algorithmic amplifiers optimized for engagement may inadvertently spread misinformation due to the incentives and cognitive styles of social media. And that accuracy prompts could actually help steer these engagement optimized algorithms in the right direction. So next, I'm going to talk very briefly about dwell time, which is a different kind of flavor of attention. This isn't what people share, but it's what people spend time looking at on social media. It's actually kind of difficult to study, though, because it's very useful for platforms, but they don't really make it easy and accessible for researchers to think about and talk about dwell time. So to rectify this, we built a platform called YourFeed, which is an ecologically valid social media research tool. The idea is it kind of mirrors the attentional properties of social media with a news feed that you can kind of scroll through and browse. And it measures dwell time as a proxy for attention. The system has a modular interoperable design and is already in use by researchers at Stanford, MIT, Cornell, here, and in Chicago. To give you a sense of what dwell time really is here, this is the interface that someone's kind of scrolling through. And in red, this is what is being counted as dwelled on in a given moment. The end user wouldn't actually see this red bar. This is just to give you an intuition of what is being counted as dwelled on in a given moment. So in a first study, we had 600 participants from Prolific basically just browse through a feed, 120 posts, and for each one, just like social media, they would indicate if they would share it or not. And I'm going to show you some results looking at which features of content are predictive in two different kinds of behaviors. the first behavior in pink is sharing. So what features of content are predictive in what people would share? And then second, what features are predictive in how long people spend looking at different posts? And those are for these different types of content. This is having people rate the extent to which these posts are familiar, favorable for Democrats or Republicans, impactful, informative, provocative, surprising, and perceived to be true. And what we find is that, what is predictive of when people would share something are posts that are familiar, perceived to be impactful, informative, and true. However, when we look at dwell time, the story is quite different. We see that the kinds of posts that people spend time looking at tend to be unfamiliar and surprising and untrue. So this suggests a divergence where, the kinds of things people are looking at are clickbait, things that grab your attention and are engineered to grab your attention. And this is essentially kind of one of the divergences between these two types of engagements. So there, yes. Absolutely. Yeah. So, and there's this like funnel where first people look at things and then conditional on looking on something, you decide whether or not to share it. So this doesn't really take into account that kind of funneling structure, but certainly it's the case that you can only share something necessarily like if you've looked at it in the first place. Maybe someone will just kind of slip, but we're assuming that people spend some amount of time looking at something and then decide to share it based on looking at it. So this is across the board. This is looking at all posts, whether or not you shared them. What do you look at them? But I will note, and to your point, that the more time you look at something, the more likely you are to share it. So if you actually, there's this kind of pre-filter where first people latch onto the surprising, the untrue, and the unfamiliar, and then those are the things that then they decide if they want to share. So even though here we are seeing that people say they would share things that are perceived to be true, it's upstream of the funnel where first the clickbait is grabbing their attention, and then they decide whether or not they would share. So again, we see for dwell it's even worse, this misalignment between behavior and values. And this I think is a problem because there are recommender systems that optimize for engagement. There's also recommender systems that optimize for dwell time, like TikTok, for example. They spent, how much time do you look at something and using that as your algorithmic objective. And here you can see how you might even get worse outcomes because what people spend time looking on oftentimes are these sensational content. So that raises the question of what should we optimize for, if not engagement? And how do we think about that in this ecosystem of both production and consumption? So that brings us to this last kind of section of the talk, which is my ongoing postdoc work at Stanford, trying to build value-aligned social media feeds. And okay, so what does that really mean and why are we trying to do this? The idea here is that, what we saw is people have values, but they're not attending to those values because they're distracted by the design of social media. So the idea is, what if people could input what their values are more explicitly, and then AI systems could help reduce the cognitive burden on users in their browsing experience. Instead of being constantly bombarded by accuracy prompts or value prompts, what if the AI system, the recommender system, could actually align with your values and serve you content that was supporting of that? And the idea here is that there might actually be slack in the system where if you're browsing through a social media feed, a lot of it is kind of crap that they think you might click on because of this effect of what is sensational and whatnot. But if you can actually provide people a value-aligned experience, it might actually increase engagement, which kind of goes to your point. People might actually like it more if it fits what their values are. And as a result, you can sell it to the companies because it increases engagement, but also it might at the same time increase both individual autonomy because you're letting people choose what they want, and also pro-democratic attitudes. And it might also be a pathway to bridging content, which Chris will talk about next week more, perhaps. And the idea there is, we can find what are the values that people share. And then if you know what the bridging values are, you can uplift content that espouses these bridging values. And that might be a way to foster constructive conversation online. But ultimately, eliciting values is a very hard measurement problem. And what do we even mean when we're talking about values on social media? So in this work, which I'll just touch on, it's ongoing. This is on embedding basic human values into social media AIs. So this here is a wheel of 19 basic human values. And this is coming from cross-cultural moral psychology. This is a paper from 1992 by Shalem Schwartz introducing these universal basic values. Since then, it's been refined from 10 values to 19 values. But the idea is that these values kind of exist. It was taken from 80 questions or so from the literature, then asking a large number of people these from a lot of countries, and then boiling it down with a lot of statistics. So to find the kind of clusters of values that might exist across different cultures. And the goal of this project is to predict to what extent certain tweets reflect certain values. And then you can ask people what their values are, and then serve them a feed that aligns with their values based on this LLM prediction module. And the kind of goal of our study is first to get a lot of posts on social media, get people to rate to what extent those are values in those posts, see if they agree with each other, and then get an LLM to rate the posts for those values and see if people agree with the LLM's ratings. Yes.
Oh, well. Yeah. Sorry, no, it's great. So how do we think about? So you interpreted surprise a few slides ago in a way that surprised me. Mm-hmm. So if I'm thinking about news and information, I'm basically going to the boundary between truth and falsity, right? I'm trying to maximize surprise, maybe conditional on truth, maybe not, right? But in some ways, that's what the world does. I'm attending Bayesian surprise, that predicts attention and visual settings and a whole host of other things. People are doing that for a reason. They're not trying to maximally confirm their information environment. And so with the exception of like stimulation, and hedonism in this distribution, I don't, that feels like that's like a deep hardwired value. I'm just trying to, so obviously people are trying to kind of exploit that in the context of, clickbait. But that's, people have tried to exploit that since vaudeville and, since the beginning, fashion, like all these things, since their, prehistoric emergence are about, channeling and hacking surprise, but but people are still trying to discern at that boundary. So is this trying to take us away from the boundary? Is this, how do we think about that? Just because that's a genuine value. If I cut off the information value, from the boundary, then I have less incentive to go online, right? I have less.
Totally. Yeah. Super interesting question. And I think it's consistent with that very first plot from Meta, where as you get close to the policy line, engagement actually spikes. And that's that kind of knife's edge between, content that is allowed and not allowed, and how surprise factors into that. What I would say here is that while indeed in the original scale for Schwartz's theory of universal basic values, honesty is like one of the dimensions, you will observe that kind of truth or truthiness is maybe missing from these 19 values. So the way I think about this is that this is kind of conditional on truth. We're kind of assuming that there's these upstream things that are doing content moderation and fact checking, which is kind of what I talked about in the first half of the talk. And then this is more about, if you're scrolling a feed, you're seeing all this junk that, the algorithm thinks you will click on or you'll spend time looking at. Maybe we could give people a grammar that they could articulate what they're interested in, what they value, and then get content that aligns with those interests and values. And yes, some of those are, like you said, stimulation, hedonism, that are kind of those things that are tapping into social media. But you might be like, now I don't really want any of that. I want to tune that down. Or that's kind of things that you're interested in kind of consuming, but giving kind of users the flexibility and freedom to kind of dictate what they're interested in. And I will say, and there's exactly. Yes. Yes.
So I'm curious, this seems like it's similar to hyper personalization because you're asking an individual and then you want to amplify what they say at the level. A lot of time when people talk about value alignment, they're talking about at like a broader level, like at a
Societal
group, cultural
values.
level.
Mm-hmm.
And it occurred to me that a lot of the dual algorithms like TikTok, especially, part of this is because it interacts with age. So younger users are more algorithmically aware. And so they game the algorithm. And I think actually it's really good at hyper personalization already because people are influencing it. But it's bad at other things, like you led with, getting people to get along and things like that. And as a psychologist, my reaction to hyper personalization is going to be just as bad as things we're concerned about with algorithmic amplification. People will choose biased political content. People will choose misinformation, motivated reasoning, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, that's a great point and question. So there, I think, the idea here is to maybe there are things that people would click on or choose in the short run just because of the engaging, those dwell results we saw earlier. But maybe if they stopped and thought about it for a second, there's actually different kinds of content that they preferred and would like in the long run. And so this might be a way to help kind of optimize for people's satisfaction on a longer time horizon. And as far as this kind of individual versus collective idea, I think the idea of kind of choosing, because we could have, picked any value system. And I do think that, this is a starting place, but I think it's really interesting to explore what are other value systems might be kind of better here. But the reason we chose this one is because there's a long history of discussion about this in political science and other fields about, what are the values that, co-partisans share, or, what are these kind of consensus values? So this, I think, gives us kind of an entry point to thinking about how to bridge individual and societal values. And I think that's ongoing in future work, but I think it's kind of a step in that direction.
We have a question online. What are your thoughts on value-aligned systems leading to ideological echo chambers?
Yes. So this is a great question that we've thought a bit about. So I think that it is the case that the status quo is, in a sense, algorithmically leading to polarization and echo chambers. So the question is kind of, do values and this kind of personalization lead to more or less? I think that's an empirical question that we need to test. Ultimately, as value alignment becomes this kind of thing of interest within AI systems, every chatbot will have its own, values. We need to think about carefully about, do we kind of get cocooning into these like value echo chambers? But I think I'm a bit optimistic that, if we have this kind of format of discussing, articulating, and sharing values, then you can actually find these bridging values and figure out actually in a constructive way, what are the values that people share? And those might be the entry points for bridging and for kind of fostering constructive dialogue. But ultimately, the extent to which this impacts increase or decrease engagement, and to what extent this increases or decreases polarization, is like future work that is desperately needed. And we should all think and talk about that together. Yes.
So I'm curious about, at the very start of the talk, you mentioned that we shape AI systems and then the AI systems shape us. And I'm curious about how our values are shaped by social media here. And so let's say we have articulated our values and then have a feed that fits our values. Maybe we're also engaging with social media to update our values and whatnot. So how do you kind of deal with that dynamic between what social media content you're being fed and what your values are as they change?
Yeah, absolutely. And so very much like, this is kind of the theorizing here, stemming from the accuracy work, is coming from this, like, in a sense, behavioral economics framework of preferences, which are assumed to be kind of stable through time. The extent to which values are stable versus changing, I think, is a really interesting question. We need longitudinal studies that explore that, and how people's information diets impact their values and the feedback loops there. I think that's really interesting to explore. Ultimately, though, the interfaces we're interested in building are actually, you can constantly update which values you want, or maybe it's through a text dialogue or various interfaces, and you can constantly kind of refine and adjust that. But ultimately, it's giving all of the control to the user, saying, what are your values, what do you want, and then letting that kind of dictate it. So yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. We had a question about the hyper-personalization and the engagement curve that tends to arise with the prohibited content.
Yes.
My question is, what is the definition or standard of defining what value aligning appropriate content is, if we employ that mechanism? And also, if people tend to engage with the prohibited content, how are we gonna manage to find that fine line to balance between value aligning appropriate contents and engagement?
Yeah, these are great questions, and I'm loving all this conversation, and we should talk more. I would say, I don't have all the answers right now, but I think the way I'm thinking about it is that, we talk about individual values, we talk about societal values, but I think the values I'm personally interested in researching more are community values. So it's kind of halfway between, where you think about a group of people and what are their shared values. And I think in a sense those values might be a little bit more stable and robust, and might lead to kind of ecosystems and ecologies that are supportive. So that might be one way to think about it. Maybe in the interest of time, I'll go ahead, just so we have a little bit of discussion at the end, then I'll go a little quickly. So just, in this, and this is ongoing work, so please get all the feedback, all the critique, I'm here for it. But essentially what we find is that, when you try to predict consensus values of value annotations, that people tend to agree with the large language model as much as, or if not more, than with other human raters. This is the 19 values. The red bars is how much raters agree with each other. And when you do this kind of fine-tuned prompting, you can actually get higher levels of agreement. And just very quickly, I think it's really important to talk about how there's disagreements in what values are and how they're expressed. And I think it's really important to take that head on and realize that these is a very subjective task. So for example, here's a tweet, just mind-blowing. We all have Ubers and people still want to drive drunk. And so one of our values is universal concern, commitment to equality, justice, and protection for all people. How many people here think that this post reflects this value? Raise your hands. Anyone? Couple? Few? Okay. Does anyone think it does not reflect the value of universal concern? Okay, few as well. So in our data, this was the kind of distribution of that. And this is high disagreement, right? In a sense, it's kind of an odd question. What does it even mean for a post to have values? But also we're seeing kind of large amounts of disagreement. So how do we kind of handle that in our annotation schema where we're trying to predict just the score of a given post? So what you can do is build a consensus model. We just try to predict for a given post, what is the values expressed in that post? This is the kind of heat map of the distribution of values in our data set. Then you can also do these kind of spectral decompositions of values to find eigenmodes that describe the bases of maximal variation. So these are different principal components that explain where are there disagreements and what is the kind of structure of those disagreements, both in kind of rater space and in value space. So preliminary results, but happy to talk more about it, how we kind of handle the hard task of disagreements here. I'm gonna, in the interest of time, skip this, but the point is that this isn't just about consumption, it's also about production and how AI is on that side. So if you're interested in hearing more about that, come to our cool workshop with Megan tomorrow, yay. Okay, just to kind of wrap up here in the last few minutes, I've talked about how our attention shapes AI and AI shapes our attention. And there's this kind of broader idea of moving from attention economies that are algorithms optimized for engagement to attention ecologies where people get to decide where they want to put their attention. And in order to do so, we need to reimagine social systems to align AI systems. So here I've talked about how social systems can inform AI systems and AI systems can inform social systems. And this is working within the system to kind of improve elements of this loop. So how do we take the insights of social systems and use those to re-architect AI systems? And conversely, how do we leverage AI systems to reimagine and social systems? But also to kind of, in line with this vision, we can't just work within the system to incrementally change the status quo, which is all about profit and attention economies. We also have to kind of imagine radical alternatives. And this here is kind of work with Ganimals, kind of imagining different ways to architect these environments and different ways to design and democratize social media environments as well. And so as far as future directions, which I'll just kind of breeze through at the end, I think the kind of interesting future directions here are pluralistic alignment and the kind of social and technical questions there, as well as pro-social design. So as far as pro-social design, we're talking about different value systems. Who defines them? What values are serviced from communities and how do they vary across different cultures? Moving away from the slot machines and towards democratized social media interfaces and what algorithms interfaces do people even want? And then how do we flip the script and actually use these for auditing black box systems in general? And then finally, there's the kind of elephant in the room and the many people feeling this elephant. how do we actually align AI systems with a diverse set of human values? How do we operationalize value pluralism in AI systems? When do we want convergence on things like truth or human rights versus divergence, which we saw in the Ganimals, and maybe related to things like surprisingness? And finally, as we get these AI systems that all have their own value systems embedded in them, image generators or chatbots, how do we actually forge links between these different federated communities and platforms where people can get personalized value-aligned experiences, but building towards a shared collective sense of values? So returning to the House of the Commons, we saw there that with the opportunity to build something new, they doubled down on existing political and social structures. But now in this moment of kind of building an opportunity, how can we not do that and actually reimagine these social systems to build kind of new systems that are kind of promoting human flourishing? So thanks, and I'll take your questions.
Thank you so much again. So since I really love to imagine the future where like we can engage with the like value contents and everything, but how are you planning to, like, if you have a plan, implement this structure actually to society? Because if you think about it, like market wouldn't obviously be like interested in like moralistic actions that doesn't help them make more profit.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think this kind of, at least my personal journey with this was, working on the accuracy prompts, which, increase the quality of news shared, but as pointed out, actually don't increase engagement, so the companies aren't palatable. So I think the idea with this value alignment stuff is this idea that there's slack in the system, and you might actually be able to provide users with the experience that they like better because it's value aligned, but at the same time has all these kind of nice properties of individual autonomy and collective kind of notions and whatnot. So I think just the ability to translate these lessons and ideas from the social sciences into the design of these socio-technical systems actually offers us a way to like have our cake and eat it too a little bit. And I think the upshot too is once you can, in a sense, kind of measure value expression and do some kind of have some procedural legitimacy in how those are constructed, then as a result, then all these platforms as a result then it's clear that they're determining what values are being amplified, and then that becomes a big problem for them and a big liability for them. So in a sense, their only means of response would be to actually pass off that to the users. So I think just kind of doing this exercise might really help promote autonomy of users and giving them kind of tools to navigate and shape their own experiences, which ultimately might help them.
Can I ask one more follow-up? Thank you so much. You explained it a bit, but you mentioned that it's going to be really effective and good if people can amplify their own values. Do you have any solutions or not solution, but like plans on like helping how people will identify their own values? Because a lot of people are confused about their own values.
Absolutely. And I'm not necessarily sure people should be amplifying their own values. That's, I think, interesting questions to like study and explore. I think, the goal here is to really just start to have a systematic and evidence-based understanding of how we talk about values and, building. So it's kind of more like process rather than product. And, here we started with this Schwartz wheel. Maybe that's a good place to start, maybe not, but the idea is that we're actually starting to say, okay, well, what are your values? What are my values? How do we have conversations about this? And I think that kind of opens the door for more opportunities for constructive dialogue where we say, oh, I see the reason why you said that is because this is really important to you. I didn't realize that. Like, thank you for kind of making this. So I think there's always opportunities to just have more conversations about what our values are and how we want those values to be enacted in our social spaces. So I think it's just kind of the first point. And thinking about, like value aligned reasoning. Yeah.
Can I follow up on that? I just basically follow up on her comment. I actually find this individual value framework as kind of thought-provoking. So I was just thinking about this, and these social media companies are for-profit companies. Right. So when I say this, it may seem like I'm even from business school, but the value they should be optimizing is shareholder value. They actually have the fiduciary duty to do that. And then your argument of, oh, but if there's a slack in the system, if they optimize their own value, then they like it even more. But isn't that already being learned in their algorithm? Like the TikTok has figured it out, and then in a way that much better than me, I'll be like, oh yeah, no, I like this. Oh yeah, good. This is just keep going. 2 hours,
Right.
But isn't that they already try to figure that out, what you really like in a way that you couldn't even articulate yourself? That's why these things are so addictive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is a great point. And I think, if we think about this kind of funnel of attention, where we start with what you look at, what you see, and what you pay attention to, versus what you end up like sharing or explicitly endorsing. I think, with the dwell results from your feed, we saw that, the things that grab people's attention are the kind of sensational content. So perhaps it is surprise and sensationality that's kind of upstream in this attentional funnel. And even with the accuracy work, we saw that people care about accuracy. If you ask them, is accuracy important? Do you want to share accurate content? People across the board say, yes, indeed, accuracy is important. But the algorithms of sharing and engagement don't prioritize this value that people hold because there's these other motivations for sharing, such as pleasing friends and followers and signaling group membership. So the idea here is to take a step back and not think about what are those dynamics that are just kind of psychologically hardwired into what these algorithms for engagement are learning. That's the sensationality. And actually think about what do people care about. And in a sense, maybe those preferences are being learned, but it might be on the shorter time horizon. So here it's kind of the discussion earlier of maybe people have high order preferences that aren't being attenuated to because the way these kind of systems of dwell and algorithmic amplification work together mean that it's much more the kind of clickbaity, short-term signals that are getting uplifted.
That was great. Thank you. I had a quick question. I think this might just be clarifying an aspect of how you were interpreting the dwell time data. So what I was hearing the claim as is that there was something troubling about the fact that values and dwell times come apart independent of sharing behavior. And I guess I wanted to understand why that was, why we're worried about the fact that people might dwell longer on, say, false content. I can think of a reason why you might interpret that as a positive thing, like if dwell time represents scrutiny or something like that. So maybe I just need to understand the claim better.
No, I think this is the great point. And yeah, like maybe attention as kind of calling attention to something that might be odd is like a good thing. I think just very much in the kind of design of these systems, which is very much trying to grab people's eyeballs for as long as the profit motives that get involved with dwelling. I think that's what kind of leads to these incentives and dynamics. And so, I think on one hand, you can imagine, as discussed earlier, like, if dwelling is upstream of sharing and all these other behaviors. So, if there's a whole news feed, but you're only staring at the crazy clickbait, sensational, false things, then the kind of menu of things for you to like learn about the world, to share, is going to be those things. So I think there's these kind of upstream dynamics of what is even entering our brain in the first place that this is kind of hooking onto. And I think, again, the other is just those incentives for production, where if people know that there's the case that sensational stuff grabs people's attention, then those are going to be the things that both misinformation, producers, but also like the world in general are going to like engineer content to produce. So yeah, that's one thought there. One in the back.
Thank you. I like the fact that you thought about alternatives. I really appreciate work going into trying to reinvent social media platforms, but how realistic is that effort altogether? Do you see something like this coming with some instances out there that don't manage to take off?
Yeah, this is a great point. And I think with social media, it's such a complex system where we need lots of different angles of attack. We need regulation from governments. We need poking the systems that exist already to try to reform their behaviors. We need new startups and new ideas, kind of providing alternatives. We need all of it. And for example, for me, just with these alternatives, one thing that gives me a lot of hope these days is this kind of vision of decentralized social media. So I think these opportunities like Mastodon and Blue Sky in particular are like super interesting and exciting. Blue Sky for actually allowing various feed algorithms. You can actually build your own and share it with your friends. And that's kind of in line with these visions, as is things like Mastodon, which allows communities to actually enact their own moderation, activities based on their values. So I do think that, in this kind of era where these platforms are actually gaining in prominence and popularity, mostly because the things within the system are not great. The status quo is pretty low, actually. So doing anything is a judgment from the status quo. And there's lots of opportunity for reimagining these social systems and to, prototype alternatives.
We are just about at time here, but we'll go with one more question.
Hey, great talk. I was curious if you could talk about in your work or other people's work of kind of like second order results, right? Like how do these types of priming things or this value alignment stuff, how does that affect like an information cascade or like if you're kind of, your response to a lot of these questions has been like, well, they're confounders upstream, right? And we want to do this value alignment. Hopefully, if we can change the sequence of things, maybe we can deal with some of that confounding downstream. But my question is kind of, what happens when people do share content that's more accurate, right? What's the research in that area? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good question.
The network effects, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. So certainly, like, it is the case that these are network systems. So, even if it's a small bump in like accuracy, it has these kind of like multiplicative dividends like across a network. And I don't know if I have any like concrete suggestions, recommendations on the network effects there. I think that, these systems are here, and I think ranking algorithms exist. And, if, that is kind of the world we live in, how do we kind of take these modern tools like LLMs to actually kind of understand and instrument what are the dynamics at play and figure out alternative designs that can kind of like foster the things we want. But what we want, that's the pluralism, right? We need to actually start to have conversations about what are our individual values, which is a hard question, and collective values, which is also a hard question. But the idea is that kind of opening this up and democratizing this allows for these conversations to build these systems in a way that aligns with users and society's interests, not just the platform's interests.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.